If the past years of AI were defined through marvel, hype, and rising expectations, 2026 has arrived with a paradox. In this video, I set out 12 trends that will define the upcoming year. The perspectives that I'll be sharing come from a decade of working closely with governments and business leaders, as well as some of the newest data that is both published as well as unpublished. My name is Walter Pasquarelli. Some of my analysis has also been published in the BBC, The Economist, the Financial Times. I'm also an affiliated researcher at Cambridge University. I should say I'm not a fan of predictions, so really you should see this more as almost like trends that provide a taste of the direction in which the field is currently going to. This is AI 2026. The first trend is that the web as we experience it today will collapse under the weight of artificial intelligence. Now, what do I mean with that? Currently, the way that most people access the web is through a web browser, and they might be using Google Chrome, they might be going on Instagram, on Facebook, they might be shopping on Amazon. This is what essentially we call the platform-based internet economy. Various large platforms that dominated the web as it stood really since the turn of the millennium. Few people have actually looked at OpenAI's product strategy that was published on the US Department of Justice website. In that strategy, they highlight what they actually want to transform ChatGPT into. Their idea is not just to make it a chatbot that you can answer questions, but essentially make it into the gateway of the entirety of the internet. Let me explain. Imagine you want to book some concert tickets to see your favorite artists, but you want to understand what's the best season to book that, when is this artist coming, and is there maybe a city where I can do that coincides with some of my other travel arrangements. That is essentially a smarter way of booking, of making financial transactions that OpenAI wants to capitalize on. Now, part of the reason is that OpenAI, as has been widely reported, has still some financial pressures and they still haven't figured out an effective way to really monetize ChatGPT and some of their other products. To mention some numbers, in 2025, OpenAI made $13 billion in revenue. However, they have a $115 billion cumulative cash burn through 2029 and about $1.4 trillion in computing commitments over the next year. So the money that they're going to invest in data centers. Now, they need to make that money back somehow. If we bring it back to this idea of GPT being essentially the gateway to the internet, that could be billions and trillions of transactions that they would make from everyday users that effectively purchase things across the entirety of the web. That is also related to why OpenAI is currently experimenting with potentially including ads into ChatGPT. So the prediction that we can make here is that ChatGPT will push harder to become the default gateway to the web through which you will be interacting with any kinds of service that you will be using. And naturally, from the perspectives of government and regulators and policymakers, there will inevitably be questions whether OpenAI's ChatGPT, if they succeed, is becoming a monopoly. As far as personal uses of artificial intelligence are concerned, one of the things that very few people predicted and saw coming is the use of AI companions. And that means essentially systems that people use to share personal ideas, to ask it for advice that range from health issues to financials, even to some of their dating and mental health concerns. That trend is likely going to continue and accelerate even further in 2026. Across a behavioral survey that I oversaw myself with 1,500 people from the US and the UK, we saw that well over 70% have already experimented with AI companions, which is roughly the same ballpark figures that other studies have concluded as well. Now, the thing becomes a lot more interesting when we look at what do they actually ask these tools. We found that this is not just chatting, but it's using AI for making decisions over meaningful areas of their life. So to give you some numbers, about 1/3 of respondents across all age groups have acted at least once in the past 3 months on AI advice over the advice of a trusted human expert. And this was in areas surrounding, for example, health, relationships, financial, or career advice. We also find that emotional attachment is measurable, and specifically for 25 to 34-year-olds who might be going through phases in their life like buying a house, starting a career, maybe meeting their spouses, maybe they want to get married. 7.5% said that they rely on artificial intelligence companions for their emotional stability. That is massive. And that does not even take into account the things that are a lot harder to research. So one thing that is widely underreported, but that we published in our research, is X-rated AI companions. And we have a more deeper investigation coming into that in the next 2 weeks. That relates to essentially tools that are used for erotic purposes or sexual fantasies. And there we find that the top 10 erotic AI platforms, one of them being, for example, Candy AI, make up already half the web traffic of OnlyFans. So this is major. It's very underreported, but we can expect it to rise even further as these tools generate increasingly hyper-realistic outputs that feel real to users. We're likely going to see AI reshaping culture. Up to this point, most discussions around artificial intelligence center around business productivity, intelligence, the future of jobs, increasingly the personal use cases. But we can see that increasingly AI-generated synthetic media, think of music, film, art, videos, is really reshaping cultural conversations themselves. And that naturally brings up a question of whether people will accept it. And here we have some very interesting survey data as well. So across a similar survey that we run with 1,500 people, US, UK, we found that for the most part, people still want art, music, political information, and so on to have been developed by a human. But their behavior tells us kind of a different story. So we saw that in November 2025, a song called Walk My Walk by an artist called Breaking Rust became the first AI-generated song to top a Billboard chart. The track accumulated about 4.6 million Spotify streams. The artist got around 200,000 TikTok followers, and it had a presence in about 150,000 TikTok videos. And later on, Billboard actually confirmed that Breaking Rust was just one out of 6 other acts that featured in the charts in the previous months. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. There have been numerous other acts, one of them called Predador de Pareca, which is an X-rated AI song that became viral in the whole of Latin America, and people danced to it as if just nothing happened. Now, the key thing here to understand is that this whole issue around authenticity and human involvement matters only so long as we can tell the difference. But now that we are reaching hyperrealism, that means the distinction between real and synthetic has effectively blurred, people will no longer be able to assess that. Part of why creating AI-generated music and art is so appealing is that creating this content is very cheap and it scales very fast. So the prediction for 2026 is that we can probably expect to see a lot of these synthetic media tracks to spread the charts, spread into music production, spread into video productions. Maybe we're even going to see the next Hollywood blockbuster produced by a kid in a garage using an ordinary consumer laptop. And with that, we're now entering the hardware and physical AI category. I believe that 2026 will become the year where humanoid robots became real products as a consumer category. There have been some companies, one being, for instance, 1X Technologies, that made already quite some big media splashes when they showcased essentially their humanoid robot called Neo. Now, they announced that Neo will start shipping as a consumer product in 2026. And this is different from other kinds of robotics that were integrated, for example, in industry. Think of automotive or maybe manufacturing. If you look at the pricing, the whole humanoid would cost around $20,000. But like most companies, you can also get a subscription for $499 per month. So that means that they're, for now at least, targeting really the upper strata of society, potentially more affluent people who can afford that. But really this pricing, which is more consumer-based rather than industry-based, means that the diffusion of these humanoids is likely going to be something that we can see in 2026. It should be said that there still are some bottlenecks. For example, their ability to move or their ability to detect objects, lift objects, or create order in, for example, an untidy household is still something where they're struggling. So most likely, there will be a human supervisor behind the camera that will be looking at whichever areas they're currently active in. The CEO of 1X Technologies called this essentially almost like a social contract, that you get this extra helper, but then they might be able to peek inside your house. For the time being, this is probably something that people will have to be willing to take into account. But what's clear is that one way or another, they're coming. One of the big transformations that already started years ago and will likely continue into 2026 is the race to dethrone the iPhone. The smartphone is optimized for tapping, for swiping, for apps, whereas artificial intelligence will increasingly become conversational, ambient-based, and always on. That means that the smartphone is not the right gateway for making the best use of technologies. And it's something that we've always done historically. Laptops did that for intelligence. Smartphones did that for providing a gateway to the web. The big news here is that OpenAI hired the former Apple designer Johnny Ive, who previously was involved in designing the iPhone, the iPad, and other several groundbreaking hardware devices. But we don't know much except that A, a prototype has been developed, and B, that it's going to launch in probably less than 2 years, according to Sam Altman. And there have been several other examples, one being Humint's AI pin that was essentially a pin with a camera, and you could talk to it and it would essentially use AI tools for creating some analysis of your surroundings. That product was shelved. It sold only about 10,000 units against 100,000 unit targets. Meta has had this collaboration going on with Ray-Ban, and they sold approximately 2 million units since launch, and they're planning on selling another 10 million units per year by the end of 2026. For the next key trend, we're going to look at business adoption. 2026 is likely going to be the year where businesses will stop just experimenting with AI tools, but it will start reshaping companies. To get us started on this one, there have been a number of stats and studies being floating around over the past months, which garnered a lot of media attention. The most infamous one perhaps was produced by MIT, which said that 95% of all AI projects fail. And that already creates massive headlines, clearly. However, looking at the methodology, there are several issues with that study. The number one thing is that they surveyed people who were already experiencing issues with AI adoptions. So it's like asking people who have an issue whether they do have an issue, and that creates bias. The second issue is that their sample size was quite small. And thirdly, their timelines based on which they actually measured this business adoption was about 6 months, which is an incredibly short window for assessing AI adoption across enterprises. But moving on from this, what we see across several other studies is that about 88% of organizations now use AI regularly, up from 78% in 2024. Now, the question is, of course, what do we mean with AI? Are we referring to ChatGPT? Are we referring to a Copilot? Or are we referring to any kinds of more complex solutions that enterprises sometimes adopt? What's telling is that enterprise generative AI spending reached $37 billion in 2025, which was 3 times more than the year before. At the same time, when we look inside companies, what we can see is that when it comes to AI adoption, those that rely on third parties succeed at about 67% of the times, whereas people who try and build AI solutions internally, only 22% of projects actually succeed. And that's also reflected into how companies approach AI, where we now see 76% of companies preferring to buy rather than build, up from 53% in 2024. For 2026, we're probably going to see a number of trends taking shape. Number one is that the pilot theater will probably collapse because top-level executives will want to see profit and losses. What is the impact on the balance sheet? Either it succeeds or we scrap it. And that's intimately related to the fact that we're going to see more and more companies buying and a new economy of AI providers emerging and solidifying over the next years. But if there's one lesson for business leaders here, is that the companies that are going to succeed are not the ones who experiment the earliest, but the ones who restructure the fastest. And the reason for that is while we think of AI as a technical problem, in most cases it's actually an organizational one. Now, we couldn't really do a video on artificial intelligence if we did not speak about issues on AI and jobs. 2026 could be the first year where we're going to see some backlash against AI from labor markets and politics. So one study from the World Economic Forum predicted that by 2026, AI could eliminate up to 85 million jobs. And typically when people hear these kinds of numbers, they understandably get quite scared. That same study, however, predicted also that by that same year, AI could add up to 97 million jobs. There have been numerous other studies produced over the past years that said, for example, that AI will impact white-collar workers. Some others said it's going to create a graduate job level crisis. Some others said that it's going to impact more like cab drivers. From what we know, core skills of 39% of workers have to be updated by 2030. However, only 6% of organizations have restarted reskilling trainings in a meaningful way. And this speed compounds another structural issue. Evidence from finance, scientific research, and creative work shows that top performers who use AI become exponentially more productive, while average workers stay average. In practice, it means that if you're someone who is excellent at what they do, you have a steady client base that can actually afford some of your services, you'll be in an excellent position. But for the cheaper service providers, there is undoubtedly going to be some competition against these kinds of AI systems. This explains why 52% of workers worry about AI's impact, and that will undoubtedly create some backlash once the impacts of these AI systems on people's jobs and professions do materialize. 2026 is going to be the first stress test for the AI boom. In the past years, there have been increasing concern about a potential AI bubble currently taking shape. And here we have actually some really good data that can provide an insight into some early signals. So in mid-November 2025, Reuters reported on Bank of America's Global Fund Manager Survey that a fear of an AI bubble currently dominates an investor sentiment. And part of the reason is because of the investments in AI infrastructures and particularly data centers. So here we have the Bank of England stating that by some estimates, AI infrastructure spending over the next 5 years could exceed $5 trillion. About half of that funding would be provided by the large technology firms through external financing, most of which being debt. Now, the issue here is that there is very little doubt that artificial intelligence is likely going to be the technology that really reshapes the economy, reshapes how we live, reshapes even the political world. If there's anything that we can learn from bubbles of the previous decades and centuries, however, is that most of the times they're right about the destination. Think of railways, think of aviation, think of potentially the internet with the .com, but the timelines do not always align. Technologists are excited. Wall Street doesn't always wait. And with artificial intelligence, if the adoption doesn't accelerate, if the technology firms do not find a way to generate the kinds of revenue that are able to justify the investments, for 2026, there could be a real risk of at least a correction taking place. The question is, of course, how governments and policymakers would react to that, especially because of these narratives of the US competing against China in a so-called AI race. It's highly likely that the US, particularly under the current presidency, would provide some kinds of support to the AI firms if 2026 would bring some form of financial difficulties for those firms. We can expect intelligence in absolute terms, that's the accuracy and reliability of AI tools, to further advance in 2026, although in different directions. There has really been a step change in reasoning. GPT 5.2, for example, is reported to achieve nearly 100% accuracy rate on AMY 2025. AMY 2025 is a math competition where typically high school students score mainly in single digits. Perhaps the most consequential metric, however, is in terms of agency, and that means how much an AI can work essentially independently, autonomously, without having human oversight. Meter, which is an organization that measures these agentic capabilities, has been reporting that every 6 months, agentic capabilities have been doubling over the past 7 years. There's a few predictions that we can make here. And the first one is that if agentic systems continue to improve their capabilities at this current scale, we will probably be able to see systems that don't just work for a couple of hours autonomously, but maybe even for a couple of days. But because reasoning capability does not necessarily mean truthfulness, 2026 could be the first year where we will see an agentic AI system actually creating major financial losses because it was given autonomy over critical business operations and producing outcomes that could create significant harm. Moving on, AI is likely going to become cheaper, more open, and globally reproducible. So what does this mean? A capability breakthrough only reshape the world if it spreads, if people use it, if people have access to it. This is happening alongside open source AI becoming more popular. Research shows that this is driving around 70% reductions in costs. And that means that AI is ultimately becoming cheaper to train, cheaper to run, and that creates also more deployment across various organizations. The implication for that is that open source, low-cost AI models will really intensify the global competition. And in that competition, whoever spreads the technology the most is also the same entity that decides the standards and the terms on which people access and utilize artificial intelligence. On to the penultimate trend. Looking into 2026, one big shift is a fragmentation as to who controls the AI sector. For the most part, OpenAI's ChatGPT has so far been the most mainstream, the most standard AI system that at least the public had access to and was using on an everyday basis. But looking at that first trend about how intelligence is becoming cheaper, more diffuse, and open source, there's a logical conclusion here that if AI is both very smart and widely reproducible, dominance stops being assumed and automatic. This is an area where models from China lead. According to a report from Stanford University, Chinese open source models now are on par or have even pulled ahead of their US counterparts. The reason for that is cost. Chinese models are currently at about $2.50 per million token. For governments and businesses that cannot foot the bill, that difference is significant. But there's a trade-off, and that's data sovereignty. When you use Chinese models, that data sits on Chinese servers, which is also one of the reasons why Italy blocked DeepSeek. And that has a number of implications. Number one is that no single provider can control everything. Number two is that power really fragments across regions. And the final thing is that standards, compliance, and political alignment with certain regional actors will matter just as much as raw performance. And that brings us to the final trend, which is there's not going to be one single global AI future, but many different ones depending on where you live. And we see this already playing out across governments and the different kinds of policies and governance regimes that they are producing. There's on the one hand the United States, which has been largely deregulating the AI industry, especially with this current administration. On the other hand, there's the European Union, which has brought forward the AI Act, which is considered to be the globally most comprehensive regulatory regime for artificial intelligence. And that's a different story also across the Middle East, across China, across the UK. There's obviously going to be plenty of space for collaboration, and this is going to be a defining factor as well for the upcoming year. But we see as well that on a societal basis, the perception around artificial intelligence changed drastically. For example, we see that in the United States, about 37.5% of citizens believe that artificial intelligence will provide a net benefit to society. And on the other hand, in China, that number is as high as 83%. The amount of trust that people give to AI systems across the world will ultimately define the kind of society that they're building, whether that's sharing deeply sensitive personal information to AI systems, as we saw in the previous point, or whether that's maybe more across business adoption. The paradox of AI 2026 is on the one hand an ecosystem that is characterized by increased geopolitical, economic, as well as financial uncertainties about the investments that have been made, and on the other hand, us as a society barely recognizing ourselves based on the transformations that have been occurring, from us confiding almost personal, deep, intimate information with some of these AI systems, but also being able to witness the first humanoid robots walking among us in the streets. So these are my predictions for AI in 2026. I'd love to know from you whether you agree with the trends that I've identified. Maybe I've missed something, maybe I've gotten something wrong. In any case, let me know in the comment section below. And of course, if you want to support hype-free and independent analysis on artificial intelligence, make sure to subscribe. It really helps the channel, and I have a lot of really interesting materials coming out in the next few weeks. So thanks for watching, and I wish you a great year.